He thought he had committed the perfect crime. Richard didn't just want a divorce, he wanted to leave his wife, Flora, destitute while he ran off with her father's empire and his young mistress. The ink was barely dry on the settlement papers. He actually smirked at her across the aisle, a look of pure, unadulterated victory. But he forgot one thing. The dead have a way of keeping secrets. And when Judge Thorne pulled a sealed, dust-covered envelope from his robe, Richard's smirk didn't just fade. It shattered. You are not going to believe what was written in the hidden will. The silence in courtroom 4B of the Majestic, and currently freezing, District Court of Chicago, was heavy enough to crush a man. But Richard Sterling didn't feel the weight. He felt weightless. He felt like a god. He sat in his bespoke Italian suit, the charcoal fabric costing more than most people's cars, and tapped his fountain pen against the mahogany table. Tap, tap, tap. It was a rhythm of impatience, but also of triumph. To his left sat his legal team, led by Marcus Blackwood, a man known in legal circles as the Viper. To his right, across the aisle, sat his soon-to-be ex-wife, Flora Vance. She looked small. That was the only word Richard could find for her. She was wrapped in a simple beige cardigan that had seen better days. Her hair pulled back in a messy bun, her eyes red-rimmed and fixed on her hands. She looked defeated. Perfect. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Anthony Thorne rumbled. The judge was a man of the old guard, with bushy grey eyebrows that looked like two caterpillars fighting for dominance on his forehead. He peered over his spectacles. "You understand that by signing these documents, the dissolution of your marriage to Mrs. Vance is final? The division of assets, as stipulated in the prenuptial agreement, and the subsequent modifications you've submitted, will be executed immediately." "I understand perfectly, Your Honor," Richard said, his voice smooth, like whiskey over ice. He glanced at the gallery. In the back row, trying to look inconspicuous behind a pair of oversized sunglasses, was Vanessa. Beautiful, 24-year-old Vanessa. She caught his eye and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. They had already picked out the villa in Tuscany. They had already transferred the funds to the offshore accounts in the Caymans, accounts Flora didn't even know existed. Richard looked back at Flora. "Just sign it, Elle," he whispered, loud enough for her to hear, but quiet enough to escape the court reporter's mic. "Let's end this misery." Flora's hand trembled as she reached for the pen. Her lawyer, a court-appointed public defender named Mr. Henderson, who looked like he hadn't slept in a week, leaned in. "Mrs. Sterling, are you sure? Once you sign this, you waive all rights to the Vance Corporation. You're walking away with the townhouse and the alimony. That's it." "I know," Flora whispered, her voice cracking. "I just want him out of my life, Mr. Henderson. I just want it to be over." Richard fought the urge to laugh. The Vance Corporation. It was worth nearly $400 million, and she was trading it for a crumbling townhouse in the suburbs and $5,000 a month. It was the heist of the century. Flora signed. The scratch of the pen sounded like a scream in the quiet room. Richard took the papers next. He didn't hesitate. He signed his name with a flourish. Richard A. Sterling. As he capped his pen, he looked directly at Flora. And then he did it. He smirked. It wasn't a smile. It was a sneer of absolute dominance. It said, "I won. You lost? I took everything your father built, and you are too stupid to even realize it." "Done," Richard announced, sliding the papers toward the bailiff. "Is that all, Your Honor? I have a flight to catch." Judge Thorne didn't answer immediately. He took the papers from the bailiff. He adjusted his glasses. He looked at the signature. Then he looked at Richard. "The divorce papers are in order," Judge Thorne said slowly. Richard started to rise. However, the judge's voice dropped an octave, booming through the room. Before I stamp this decree absolute, there is a procedural matter regarding the estate of the late Arthur Vance. Richard froze halfway out of his chair. Arthur? My late father-in-law. That estate was settled 5 years ago, Your Honour. I am the executor. It's closed. Sit down, Mr. Sterling, the judge barked. Richard sat, annoyed. Your Honour, this is highly irregular. What does... I said sit down! Thorne slammed his gavel. The sound echoed like a gunshot. The judge reached under his bench. He didn't pull out a stamp. He pulled out a thick, yellowed envelope sealed with red wax. The room went dead silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to stop humming. Yesterday afternoon, Judge Thorne said, his eyes locking onto Richard's. My chambers received a courier from the firm of Halloway, Finch and Partners. It seems that the late Arthur Vance left a codicil to his last will and testament. A codicil with a very specific trigger clause. Richard felt a cold bead of sweat roll down his spine. Codicil. There was no codicil. He had shredded everything. He had burned the files. The envelope, Judge Thorne continued, holding it up like a weapon, reads, to be opened only in the event that my daughter, Flora Vance, and her husband, Richard Sterling, dissolve their marriage via a court of law. Flora looked up, her eyes wide. She looked as confused as Richard felt. I object. Marcus Blackwood jumped up, his instincts kicking in. This is an ambush. We have not seen this document. We cannot verify its authenticity. It was notarized by a Supreme Court Justice, Mr. Blackwood, Thorne said dryly. I think it's authentic. The judge cracked the wax seal. The sound of tearing paper was louder than the signing had been. Richard gripped the arms of his chair. It doesn't matter, he told himself. I own the board. I own the shares. I have the voting rights. Whatever the old man wrote, it's just words. But as Judge Thorne unfolded the document, Richard saw the judge's expression change. The stern, bored look vanished. Thorne's eyes widened. He looked at Richard, then at Flora, and then... Strangely, he smiled. Well, Judge Thorne said, leaning into the microphone, it appears, Mr. Sterling, that you may have signed those divorce papers a few moments too soon. To understand the panic that was currently clawing at Richard Sterling's throat, you have to understand the man he destroyed to get there, Arthur Vance. Arthur was a titan of industry. He had built Vance Logistics from a single truck into a global shipping empire. He was a hard man, a fair man, but a man who valued loyalty above all else. And he had loved his only daughter, Flora, more than life itself. 10 years ago, Richard was nothing more than a junior analyst in the finance department of Vance Logistics. He was hungry, sharp, and morally flexible. He saw Flora not as a woman, but as a key. She was shy, artistic, and completely uninterested in the cutthroat world of corporate logistics. She was soft, and Richard knew exactly how to mold soft things. He courted her with the precision of a military campaign. Flowers sent to her art studio. Surprise trips to Paris. He played the role of the protective, adoring partner perfectly. Arthur Vance had been skeptical. The old man had eyes like a hawk, and he often looked at Richard with a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect for his work ethic. You love her? Arthur had asked Richard the night before the wedding, holding a glass of scotch that cost more than Richard's annual salary. With everything I have, sir, Richard had lied without blinking. Good, Arthur had grunted. Because if you ever hurt her, Richard, if you ever betray her, I will ensure you regret it from beyond the grave. Richard had laughed it off as the dramatic rambling of a protective father. When Arthur died of a sudden heart attack 5 years into their marriage, Richard didn't mourn. He celebrated. He immediately stepped in to help Flora with the burden of the company. "You're an artist, Elle," he had told her, stroking her hair while she cried. "You shouldn't worry about board meetings and profit margins. Let me handle it. Sign the power of attorney. I'll protect your legacy." And she had trusted him. She signed. Over the next 5 years, Richard systematically dismantled Flora's control. He appointed his cronies to the board. He diluted her shares through complex restructuring schemes that she didn't understand and didn't question. He funneled profits into shell companies. He gaslighted her, too. If she asked about money, he would sigh and tell her the company was struggling. "We're barely staying afloat, Elle. I'm working 18 hours a day just to keep us from bankruptcy," he would say, while hiding the receipts for his new Aston Martin. He made her feel small. He made her feel stupid. He isolated her from her friends, telling her they were only using her for her name. By the time he filed for divorce, claiming irreconcilable differences, Flora was a shadow of her former self. She believed him when he said there was no money left. She believed him when he said the company was worthless. That was why she accepted the townhouse and the pittance of alimony. She just wanted to escape the man who made her feel like a failure. But Richard had made one fatal error. He had underestimated Arthur Vance. Arthur knew Richard was ambitious. He knew Richard was a shark, and sharks, by their nature, eventually bite. Arthur hadn't just left a will, he had set a trap that had sat in the dark for 5 years, waiting for the exact moment Richard thought he was safe. Back in the courtroom, Judge Thorne adjusted his glasses, holding the yellowed paper up to the light. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, his voice terrifyingly calm, "you are aware, are you not, that the original merger of Vance Logistics into the holding company, the one you executed 3 years ago to consolidate your control, was contingent on the foundational bylaws of the original Vance Trust?" "Yes," Richard snapped, sweat now visible on his forehead. "Standard boilerplate. It means nothing." "On the contrary," the judge said. "It seems Arthur Vance added a poison pill clause to the trust, specifically regarding the transfer of Class A voting shares." Richard's lawyer, Marcus, went pale. "Your Honor, surely you aren't suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything, Mr. Blackwood. I am reading." The judge cleared his throat and began to read aloud. "My life's work, Vance Logistics, is intended to support my daughter, Flora. However, I recognize that predators often disguise themselves as partners. Therefore, let it be known, the entirety of the Vance estate, including all voting rights, properties, and offshore holdings." The judge paused for effect. Richard stopped breathing. "Shall remain the property of Flora Vance. However, control of these assets is granted to her spouse only so long as the marriage remains intact and faithful." Judge Thorne looked over the paper at Richard. "Intact and faithful, Mr. Sterling." I... Richard stammered. "We are divorced. The marriage is not intact. That's why the assets are divided." "Let me finish," Thorne silenced him. "In the event of a divorce initiated by the spouse, or in the event that the spouse is found to have committed adultery prior to the finalization of said divorce, the managerial clause is immediately voided." The judge turned the page. "Furthermore, should the marriage be dissolved under these circumstances, a secondary trust is activated. This trust, known as the Arthur Protocol, retroactively reclaims all assets transferred out of the primary estate during the marriage. Any officer of the company found to have facilitated the transfer of funds to personal accounts while violating their marital vows shall be subject to immediate forensic audit and criminal referral for embezzlement." The room spun. Richard felt like he was going to vomit. Retroactively reclaims. That meant everything. The villa in Tuscany, the accounts in the Caymans, The penthouse in Manhattan? "This is absurd!" Richard screamed, jumping to his feet. "You can't prove adultery. There is no proof. This is just a bitter old man's fantasy." From the back of the room, a high heel clicked on the floor. Vanessa stood up. She took off her sunglasses. But she wasn't looking at Richard with love anymore. She was looking at him with calculation. "Actually," a new voice spoke up. Everyone turned. It was Flora. She wasn't looking at her hands anymore. She was standing up. She wasn't trembling. She pulled the beige cardigan tighter around herself, but her chin was high. "I think," Flora said, her voice gathering strength, "that we might have proof." She reached into her battered tote bag and pulled out a small, black USB drive. "Before we finalize the signing," Flora said to the judge, "I'd like to submit this into evidence. My father told me to keep it safe. He told me, if Richard ever tries to leave you, check the nanny cam in the executive suite." Richard's face went from pale to grey. The executive suite. The office he had soundproofed. The office where he and Vanessa had spent countless hours mocking Flora while drinking Arthur's vintage scotch. Judge Thorne extended his hand. "Bailiff, please bring me that drive." Richard looked at the drive, then at the judge, then at the signed divorce papers. The smirk was gone. In its place was the hollow, terrifying realization that the trap hadn't just sprung. It had just cut off his head. The courtroom bailiff, a heavy-set man named Officer Miller, who looked like he'd seen everything and was impressed by nothing, took the USB drive from Judge Thorne's hand. "No!" Richard lunged forward, his composure shattering. "This is inadmissible. That drive was obtained illegally. It's a violation of privacy. Mr. Sterling," Judge Thorne's voice was like grinding gravel, "you just stated under oath that the executive suite at Vance Logistics was your primary place of business. There is no expectation of privacy regarding criminal conduct in a corporate office, especially not when the building is owned by the very trust you are attempting to defraud." He nodded to the bailiff. "Plug it in, Miller." The large monitors mounted on the walls of courtroom 4B flickered to life. The audio crackled, then hissed. The image that appeared was crystal clear. It was the interior of Richard's office, the one that had belonged to Arthur Vance. The mahogany desk was covered in blueprints and ledgers. On the screen, Richard was sitting on the edge of the desk, holding a tumbler of amber liquid. Standing between his knees, laughing and toying with his tie, was Vanessa. A collective gasp swept through the gallery. In the back row, the real Vanessa pulled her coat collar up, trying to disappear, but everyone was looking between the screen and her. On the video, the timestamp was dated 3 months prior, long before Richard had filed for divorce, and during a time he claimed he was working late to save the company. "I'm telling you, Van, it's too easy," the on-screen Richard said, taking a sip of scotch. "She signed the transfer orders this morning. She didn't even read them. She just looked at me with those big, sad cow eyes and asked if I was eating enough." On screen, Vanessa laughed, a cruel, sharp sound. "God, she's pathetic. Doesn't she wonder where the money is going?" "Flora doesn't wonder about anything I don't tell her to wonder about," Richard sneered. "I moved the last $4 million to the Cayman Shell Corp yesterday. We label it as consulting fees for a vendor in Zurich. By the time I serve her the papers next month, the Vance accounts will show a net loss. I'll give her the house, a tiny stipend, and I'll walk away with the empire." In the courtroom, Richard's face was the color of old ash. He wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking at Flora. She was watching the video, tears streaming silently down her face. But they weren't tears of sadness anymore. They were tears of validation. For years, he had made her feel crazy. He had made her feel like her suspicions were just the paranoid rants of a lonely housewife. Now, the whole world saw the truth. The video continued. "What about the old man's lawyers?" Vanessa asked on screen. "Won't they audit?" Richard laughed, throwing his head back. "They're toothless. I fired the competent ones and hired yes-men. Arthur is dead, baby. And I'm the king now. Once the divorce is finalized, we fly to Tuscany, and Flora can rot in that drafty townhouse." Richard leaned in and kissed Vanessa passionately on the screen. "Turn it off," Judge Thorne ordered. His voice was quiet, but it carried a terrifying weight. The screen went black. The silence that followed was violent. Judge Thorne slowly took off his glasses. He cleaned them with a small cloth, taking his time, letting Richard sweat. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said finally, "in my 30 years on the bench, I have seen greed. I have seen betrayal. But I have rarely seen such arrogant stupidity document itself so clearly." It's out of context," Richard croaked. It was a pathetic defense, and he knew it. "Out of context?" The judge raised an eyebrow. "You admitted to embezzlement. You admitted to fraud. You admitted to deceiving your spouse to secure an unfair settlement. And, most pertinent to the document I hold in my hand," he tapped Arthur's will, "you admitted to adultery." Judge Thorne looked at the court reporter. "Let the record show that the condition of faithfulness stipulated in the Arthur Vance Trust has been violated. The managerial clause is hereby revoked, effective immediately." "Wait!" Marcus Blackwood, Richard's lawyer, tried to salvage the sinking ship. "Your Honor, even if the prenup is voided, we are still entitled to an equitable split of marital assets gained during the—" "Mr. Blackwood, sit down before I hold you in contempt for wasting my oxygen," Thorne snapped. "There are no marital assets. There is only stolen property." The judge turned his gaze to the back of the room. "And you, Miss Vanessa Dalloway?" Vanessa froze. She looked like a deer in headlights. "I suggest you do not leave the jurisdiction," Thorne said. "As you were clearly a co-conspirator in the embezzlement scheme discussed on that tape, I am issuing a bench warrant for your detention pending an inquiry by the district attorney." Vanessa screamed. "I didn't sign anything. It was him. It was all Richard." She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the man she had been kissing on screen moments ago. "He told me it was legal. He told me it was his money. I'm a victim here." Richard whipped around, his eyes bulging. "Vanessa, shut up!" "No, you shut up!" she yelled, abandoning her sunglasses and her dignity. "I'm not going to jail for you, Richard. You said you had it handled. You said you were a genius." "Order!" Judge Thorne slammed the gavel. "Bailiff, take Miss Dalloway into custody." As the bailiff moved toward the back of the room, Richard slumped into his chair. He looked at his hands. They were shaking uncontrollably. He had walked into the courtroom a multi-millionaire. 10 minutes later, he was about to be destitute. But the nightmare for Richard Sterling was only just beginning. The chaos in the courtroom was a symphony to Flora's ears, but she remained perfectly still. She felt a hand on her arm. It was Mr. Henderson, her public defender. "Flora," he whispered, "you did good." She looked at him. Throughout the proceedings, Henderson had been quiet, almost passive. But now there was a glint in his eye that she hadn't noticed before. "How did you know to ask for the postponement yesterday?" Flora asked him. "If we hadn't waited one day, the judge wouldn't have received the letter from the firm." Henderson smiled, a small, cryptic smile. "Let's just say, Flora, that your father had friends everywhere, even in the public defender's office." Before she could ask what he meant, Judge Thorne addressed the court again. "Mr. Sterling, since the managerial clause is void, the ownership of Vance Logistics and all subsidiary assets reverts immediately to the sole beneficiary, Mrs. Flora Vance. Richard's head snapped up. You can't do that. The board will never accept it. I stacked that board. They answer to me. I think you'll find, Thorne said, glancing at a new document that his clerk had just handed him, that the Arthur Protocol accounts for your board members as well. The judge leaned forward. This court is freezing all assets held by Richard Sterling, effectively immediately. This includes personal bank accounts, real estate holdings, and the investment portfolio. You are to surrender your passport to the bailiff now. My passport? Richard stood up, panic making him irrational. I have a business trip to Zurich tonight. Not anymore, you don't, Thorne said. Unless you plan to swim. Richard looked at Marcus Blackwood. Do something. Fix this. Marcus, the viper, began packing his briefcase. He didn't look at Richard. I'm afraid I have to recuse myself from this case, Mr. Sterling. Recuse yourself. You're on retainer. My retainer is paid from your personal account, Marcus said coldly, snapping his briefcase shut, which has just been frozen. And judging by that video, I'd say you're going to be indicted for grand larceny and corporate fraud. I don't do criminal defense for indigent clients. Good luck, Richard. Marcus Blackwood turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving his client standing alone at the mahogany table. Richard looked around wildly. Vanessa was being handcuffed in the back of the room, sobbing loudly. His lawyer was gone. The judge was looking at him like he was a stain on the floor. And Flora was standing up. She gathered her purse. She looked at Richard, and for the first time in 5 years, she didn't look down. Richard scrambled toward her, stopping only when the bailiff stepped in his path. Flora, he pleaded, his voice cracking. Flora, baby, listen. It was a mistake. We can fix this. I did it for us. I was trying to build a nest egg so we could retire early. That girl, Vanessa, she meant nothing. She seduced me. I was weak. But I love you. The desperation was palpable. It was pathetic. Flora looked at him. She saw the sweat on his upper lip. She saw the terror in his eyes, and she realized that she didn't hate him. She pitied him. He was a small man who had borrowed a big man's suit, and now he was drowning in the fabric. Richard, she said softly. Yes? Hope flared in his eyes. Yes, Elle. The townhouse, she said. The townhouse? He blinked. You can have it. I'll sign it over. We can... No, Flora cut him off. I was going to say, I'm changing the locks tonight. Don't come by. She turned to Mr. Henderson. Shall we go? We shall, Henderson said. As they walked down the center aisle, the sound of Richard screaming her name echoed off the high ceilings. Flora, you can't do this! I made you! You're nothing without me! Flora! The heavy oak doors swung shut behind them, cutting off his voice with a final, satisfying thud. Outside in the hallway, the air felt cleaner. Flora took a deep breath. Are you okay? Henderson asked. I don't know, Flora admitted. I feel light, but I also feel terrified. He said he stacked the board. He said the company is empty. Even with the company back in my name, if he really stole millions, Vance Logistics might be bankrupt. Henderson stopped walking. He turned to her, and his demeanor shifted completely. He straightened his spine. The slump of the overworked public defender vanished. He looked sharp, dangerous, and incredibly competent. Flora, he said, his voice different now, firmer. Your father didn't just leave a will. He left a fail-safe. Do you remember a man named Silas Thorne? Flora frowned. Thorne, like the judge? His brother, Henderson said. Silas was your father's head of cybersecurity. He retired the day your father died. Or so everyone thought. Henderson pulled a sleek black phone from his pocket. It wasn't the cheap flip phone he had been using in court. "Richard thought he was stealing money," Henderson said, dialing a number. "But when you deal with Arthur Vance, you play by his rules. Richard hasn't been stealing money. He's been moving it into a holding pattern." Henderson put the phone to his ear. "It's time. Execute the Arthur Protocol." Richard Sterling sat in the holding cell of the county courthouse. He wasn't under arrest yet, but he was being detained until he surrendered his passport, which was currently in a safe in his penthouse. He paced the small room like a caged tiger. Think, Richard. Think. It wasn't over. It couldn't be over. Sure, the judge had frozen his known accounts, but Richard was smarter than them. He had the crypto wallets. He had the bearer bonds in the safety deposit box in Zurich. He had the go bag hidden in the ventilation shaft of his office. If he could just get to his office, he needed to get out of here. He banged on the door. "My lawyer is on his way. I have rights." An hour later, a frazzled junior associate from Blackwood's firm arrived, looking terrified. He arranged for Richard's release on the condition that he surrender his passport within 24 hours. Richard sprinted out of the courthouse. He didn't go home. He hailed a cab. "Vance Logistics Tower, and drive fast." He needed to get to the server room. He needed to wipe the drives. If they did a deep forensic audit, they wouldn't just find embezzlement. They would find the money laundering he was doing for the cartel in Miami to cover his gambling debts. If that came out, prison would be the least of his worries. The cartel didn't file lawsuits. The cab screeched to a halt in front of the gleaming glass tower that Arthur Vance had built. Richard threw a wad of cash at the driver and ran for the revolving doors. He burst into the lobby, breathless. "Mr. Sterling," the receptionist, a young woman named Sarah, looked up, startled. "Out of my way, Sarah," Richard barked, swiping his keycard at the turnstile. Beep, beep, beep. Red light. Access denied. Richard swiped again. Beep, beep, beep. Damn it. He kicked the turnstile. "Sarah, unlock this gate. My card is malfunctioning." Sarah looked down at her console. She typed something, then looked up, her face pale. "Mr. Sterling, the system says, security alert, intruder." "I am the CEO, you idiot," Richard roared. "Open it!" Suddenly, two large men in dark suits stepped out from the security office. Richard didn't recognize them. They weren't the usual rent-a-cops he paid minimum wage to sleep at the desk. These men moved with military precision. "Richard Sterling?" the taller one asked. "Who are you? Get out of my building." "This isn't your building anymore, sir," the man said calmly. "I'm with Citadel Security. We've been retained by the new majority shareholder to secure the premises." "New majority shareholder? That's my wife. She doesn't know how to hire mercenaries." "Actually," a voice boomed from the mezzanine balcony above the lobby. Richard looked up. Standing there, looking down at him, was a man Richard hadn't seen in 5 years. A man he thought had moved to Florida to play golf. Silas Thorne, Arthur Vance's old head of IT, the brother of the judge. "Hello, Richard," Silas called down, leaning on the railing. He held a tablet in his hand. "Silas." Richard stepped back. You're supposed to be retired." "And you're supposed to be a loving husband," Silas replied. "We don't always get what we want." Silas tapped the tablet. The large digital display board in the lobby, which usually showed stock prices and company news, suddenly changed. It went black. Then, lines of green code began to cascade down the screen. "What is this?" Richard demanded. "This," Silas said, "is the Arthur Protocol. You see, Richard, Arthur knew you were a shark, but he also knew you were lazy. He knew you wouldn't build your own financial infrastructure. You'd use the company's." On the screen, a list of bank accounts appeared. Cayman Holdings, 4A, Zurich Box 992. The Vanessa Fund, Richard's heart stopped. Those were his secret accounts. "You thought you were funneling money out," Silas explained, his voice echoing in the silent lobby. "But every time you initiated a transfer to a shell company, my code, embedded deep in the system kernel 5 years ago, intercepted it." "Intercepted?" Richard whispered. "We mirrored the transactions," Silas grinned. "You moved money to an account you thought you controlled, but the Arthur Protocol actually routed the funds to a blind trust held in escrow by the Federal Reserve, waiting for the trigger event." Silas tapped the tablet again. On the big screen, the balance of Richard's secret accounts dropped to 0. Cayman Holdings, 1.0, Zurich Box, Adwanuahuero. Vanessa Fund, Laronuahuahos. Then a new line appeared at the bottom. Vance Estate Recovery Trust, 48,250,000 talos. "You didn't steal a dime, Richard," Silas laughed. "You've just been acting as a very aggressive, unpaid savings account manager for Flora. Thank you for your service." Richard fell to his knees. It was gone, all of it. The money he had risked everything for. The money he had destroyed his marriage for. It was all back in Flora's pocket. "You can't do this!" Richard screamed, pounding the marble floor. "It's entrapment!" "No," Silas said. "It's estate planning." The glass doors behind Richard slid open. Blue and red lights flashed against the lobby walls. Richard turned to see 3 police officers and 2 agents in FBI windbreakers entering the building. They weren't smiling. "Richard Sterling?" the lead FBI agent asked. Richard looked at the agents, then up at Silas, then at the empty turnstile. "We have a warrant for your arrest," the agent said, pulling out handcuffs. "Charges include wire fraud, securities fraud, and thanks to the data dump we just received from a Mr. Silas Thorne, money laundering for the Mendoza cartel." Richard didn't fight. He couldn't. His legs gave out. As the cuffs clicked around his wrists, he realized the smirk he had worn in the courtroom just hours ago would be the last smile he'd have for a very, very long time. But somewhere across the city, in a quiet art studio that smelled of turpentine and hope, Flora Vance was just picking up a paintbrush. 3 months later, the seasonal chill of Chicago had turned into a biting winter frost. But inside the maximum security wing of the Cook County Jail, the temperature was always the same: cold, sterile, and smelling of industrial bleach and despair. Richard Sterling sat behind the thick plexiglass divider. He had lost 20 pounds. The bespoke Italian suits were gone, replaced by a sagging orange jumpsuit that washed out his complexion. His hair, once perfectly coiffed, was thinning and greasy. He picked up the black phone receiver. His hand shook. On the other side of the glass sat Flora. She looked radiant. She was wearing a coat of deep crimson wool, her hair loose and shining. She didn't look like the broken woman from the courtroom. She looked like a CEO. "You came," Richard said, his voice raspy. "I knew you would. You still love me, don't you, Elle? You can't just turn off 5 years." Flora looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I didn't come here because I love you, Richard. I came here because my lawyers told me you refused to sign the final release forms for the house unless I visited you personally." Richard leaned in, his eyes frantic. "I can help you, Elle. The company. It's complex. You don't know how to run it. You're an artist. You need me. Drop the charges. Tell the DA it was a misunderstanding, and I'll come back as a consultant. Behind the scenes. No one has to know." Flora sighed. It was a sound of pure exhaustion at his delusion. "Richard," she said softly, "the company just had its most profitable quarter in 6 years." Richard blinked. That's impossible." Who is running operations? I am, Flora said. And I hired back the people you fired. The people who actually knew what they were doing before you replaced them with your drinking buddies. Oh, and Silas Thorne came out of retirement. He's my new COO. Richard recoiled as if slapped. Silas! He hates business. He hates thieves, Richard. He loves the company my father built. Flora reached into her bag and pulled out a folded newspaper. She pressed it against the glass. The headline read, "Sterling verdict, guilty on all counts." Below it was a picture of Vanessa leaving the courthouse. She had cut a deal. In exchange for testifying against Richard regarding the money laundering and the cartel connections, she received probation and a hefty fine. She had thrown Richard to the wolves without a second thought. Vanessa testified for 6 hours yesterday, Flora said calmly. She told them everything. How you mocked me. How you planned to declare bankruptcy to hide the assets. How you forged my signature on the loan applications. She's a liar, Richard screamed, slamming his fist against the glass. The guard behind him took a step forward, hand on his baton. She was the one who pushed me. It was her idea. It doesn't matter whose idea it was, Flora said, folding the paper. You did it. You broke the one rule my father gave you. You weren't faithful. Not to me, and not to the legacy. She stood up. Sign the papers, Richard. Or don't. It doesn't matter. The judge has already granted a motion to bypass your signature due to your incarceration. I just wanted to see you one last time. Why? Richard whispered, tears finally spilling down his cheeks, tears of self-pity. To gloat? No, Flora said. She placed her hand on the glass, directly over his. To make sure you were real. For a long time, I thought you were a monster under my bed. I was terrified of you. But seeing you now, in this cage, blaming everyone but yourself, I realize you aren't a monster. She leaned in close to the glass. You're just a small, sad man who fumbled the best thing that ever happened to him. Flora hung up the phone. She turned and walked toward the heavy steel doors. Flora! Richard screamed, his voice muffled by the glass. Flora, don't leave me here. I can't survive in here. Flora! She didn't look back. She walked out of the prison and into the crisp winter air, where a black town car was waiting. Mr. Henderson, no, Arthur's lawyer, was waiting by the open door. He wasn't wearing his shabby public defender suit anymore. He was wearing a sharp, navy pinstripe suit that cost as much as a small car. How did it go? Henderson asked. It's finished, Flora said. She looked up at the grey sky, and for the first time in forever, the sun broke through the clouds. Let's go to the office. We have a board meeting. The executive suite on the 42nd floor of the Vance Logistics Tower had always felt like a museum to Flora. Under her father, it was a shrine to industry. Heavy oak, leather books, the smell of cigar smoke. Under Richard, it had been a cold, sterile fortress of glass and chrome, designed to intimidate anyone who walked through the door. But now, 3 months after the trial, the room breathed. Flora stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the snow swirl over Lake Michigan. The office was different now. The sterile, abstract art Richard had spent thousands on was gone, replaced by vibrant, chaotic canvases. Flora's own work. The smell of stale scotch was replaced by the scent of fresh espresso and turpentine. She turned back to the massive desk. It was covered not just in financial reports, but in sketches. Where Richard saw spreadsheets, Flora saw patterns. She had spent the last 90 days scrubbing the company clean, a forensic audit of the soul of the business. It was exhausting work. She had fired 3 more executives who had been complicit in Richard's schemes, renegotiated contracts with vendors he had alienated, and somehow amidst the chaos, kept the stock price steady. But she was tired. The imposter syndrome was a constant whisper in her ear. "You're just a painter," it said. "You're playing dress-up in your father's suit." A soft knock on the door broke her reverie. "Come in," she called out. Mr. Henderson entered. The man had undergone a transformation as dramatic as the company itself. Gone was the rumpled, overworked public defender in the ill-fitting polyester suit. In his place stood the new general counsel of Vance Logistics, wearing a sharp, navy-bespoke suit that commanded respect. He carried a leather portfolio under one arm and a small, weathered wooden box in his hands. "The Q4 projections are in, Ms. Vance," Henderson said, placing the portfolio on the desk. "Silas says the numbers are stabilizing. The market has reacted well to the news of Richard's departure." "Departure is a polite word for a 20-year sentence," Flora said dryly, sitting down. "Has there been any word from his appeal team?" "They filed a motion this morning. It was denied by lunch," Henderson said with a faint, satisfied smile. "Judge Thorne doesn't like it when people waste his time. Richard is staying exactly where he is." Flora nodded, feeling a knot loosen in her chest. "Good. And the board? Are they ready for the annual strategy meeting?" "They are waiting in the conference room." "But—" Henderson hesitated. He looked down at the wooden box in his hands. "Before you go in there, Flora, there is something we need to do. Something your father made me promise to delay until the dust had fully settled." Flora frowned. "My father gave you that box?" 5 years ago, Henderson said softly. "The day he signed the original trust. He told me, if Richard turns out to be the man I fear he is, and if Flora survives the storm, give her this, but not a moment before she stands on her own 2 feet." He placed the box on the desk. It was old, made of cherry wood, with the initials AV carved into the lid. Next to it, he placed a sealed, cream-colored envelope. "He wanted you to read the letter first," Henderson said, stepping back to give her space. Flora's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the envelope. Seeing her father's handwriting, jagged, forceful, familiar, brought a sudden sting of tears to her eyes. She took a breath, slit the envelope with a silver letter opener, and unfolded the paper. "To my dearest Ellie, if you are reading this, it means my worst fears came true. It means Richard was a fraud, and I wasn't there to protect you from him. For that, I will carry eternal regret, even in the afterlife. But if you are reading this, it also means you won. It means you fought back. It means you are sitting in my chair, probably wondering if you belong there." Flora wiped a tear that fell onto the blotter. He knew. He always knew. "I know what you tell yourself, Ellie. You tell yourself you are just an artist. You think business is about math and aggression. You think because you feel things deeply, you are weak. Richard certainly thought so. He likely saw your kindness as a defect to be exploited. Let me tell you a secret I never shared with anyone. Do you remember the summer you were 7? You set up that table on the sidewalk to sell your watercolor paintings. You priced them at 25 cents. I watched from the window. When Mrs. Gable from down the street tried to buy just one, you told her, "No, you have to buy these 3 together. They tell a story about a bird learning to fly. If you separate them, the story breaks." You didn't just sell her the paintings, Ellie. You sold her the vision. You upsold her. You understood intuitively that value isn't in the paint or the paper. It's in the connection. That is what a CEO does. Richard was a manager. Managers maintain the status quo. They move piles of money from one room to another. But you are a creator. You build things that didn't exist before. Art and business are the same thing, Ellie. They are both about bringing order out of chaos. Do not let the world harden you. Your empathy is your radar. Your imagination is your blueprint. Richard failed because he only looked at the numbers. You will succeed because you look at the people. Now, open the box. It's time to stop fixing Richard's mistakes and start building your legacy. Dad Flora let out a shaky breath, folding the letter and pressing it to her heart. A creator. She had spent her whole life thinking her art was a distraction from the real world of her father's business. He was telling her it was the qualification. She reached for the wooden box. The latch clicked open with a heavy mechanical sound. Inside there was no money. There were no stock certificates. There was a heavy, rusted iron key and a thick, leather-bound sketchbook. Flora opened the book. The pages were wallowed, filled with her father's handwriting and rough diagrams. But these weren't shipping routes or logistics tables. They were drawings of electric engines, sketches of autonomous, solar-powered cargo ships, blueprints for high-speed, magnetic levitation rail systems. "The idea vault," Henderson said softly. Flora looked up. "I remember this. He used to talk about the Green Fleet when I was a teenager. Everyone laughed at him. The board told him it was too expensive, too futuristic. They told him to stick to diesel trucks and cheap labor. He never stopped working on it," Henderson said. "He buried these plans because the technology wasn't ready, and the board was too short-sighted. He told me, 'One day the world will change, and when it does, Ellie will know what to do with these.'" Flora ran her fingers over a sketch of a hydrogen cell delivery drone. It was dated 15 years ago. Her father had been a visionary, silenced by the pragmatism of lesser men. She stood up. The fatigue was gone. In its place was a buzzing, electric energy. The same feeling she got when she stared at a blank canvas and knew exactly what she was going to paint. "Where is the vault?" Flora asked, picking up the heavy iron key. "Basement level 3, Henderson replied. "Old record storage. It hasn't been opened in a decade." "Let's go," she said, "and tell Silas to meet us there. Then tell the board to get comfortable. I'm going to be a few minutes late." 30 minutes later, the double doors of the boardroom swung open. The 12 members of the board, mostly older men in grey suits who had survived the purge, looked up. They expected an apology for the delay. They expected a hesitant woman reading from a prepared statement. What they got was Flora Vance, carrying a rusted iron box and a stack of yellowed papers, flanked by Silas Thorne and Mr. Henderson. Flora didn't sit at the head of the table. She walked past it and went straight to the whiteboard. She picked up a marker. "Good morning," she said, her voice clear and projecting to the back of the room. "For the last 5 years, this company has been operating in survival mode. We have been cutting costs, hiding losses, and drifting." She uncapped the marker. "Richard Sterling treated Vance Logistics like a piggy bank," she continued, drawing a sharp line across the board. "He thought the goal of this company was to extract wealth. He was wrong. The goal of this company is to move the world." She taped one of her father's old sketches to the whiteboard, the design for the electric autonomous fleet. "My father drew this in 2005, Flora said. The board members squinted, murmuring. He saw a future where logistics wasn't just about moving boxes, but about doing it cleaner, faster, and smarter. He was stopped by fear. He was stopped by people who said it cost too much." She turned to face them. Her eyes locked on the chairman, a man named Sterling, no relation, who had been Richard's biggest enabler. "We have spent the last 3 months cleaning up the past," Flora declared. "Today we start building the future. As of this morning, I am initiating Project Arthur. We are liquidating the old diesel fleet. We are investing the recovered funds, every dime we took back from Richard's offshore accounts, into modernizing our infrastructure. Flora, the chairman sputtered. Liquidating the fleet? That's suicide. The stock will tank. The stock will tank if we stay a dinosaur in a digital age, Flora shot back. We aren't a trucking company anymore, gentlemen. We are a technology company that specializes in motion. She looked at Silas. Mr. Thorne has already run the feasibility models. The transition will take 5 years. It will be hard, it will be expensive. But by 2030, we will be the only carbon-neutral logistics giant in the hemisphere. The room was silent. They were stunned. This wasn't the soft, weeping woman from the divorce hearing. This was Arthur Vance's daughter. "I am an artist," Flora said, her voice dropping to a whisper that commanded total attention. "And an artist knows that you cannot create a masterpiece if you are afraid to get your hands dirty. We are going to paint a new picture for this industry." She slammed the marker down on the table. "Are you with me? Or should I accept your resignations right now?" Silas Thorne smiled, a rare, genuine expression. Henderson nodded. Slowly, one by one, the board members nodded. The chairman looked at the sketch on the board, then at Flora. He closed his folder. "I'm with you, Ms. Vance," he said. Later that evening, the office was quiet again. The sun had set, and the city lights of Chicago twinkled below like a field of electric stars. Flora packed her bag. She put the yellowed letter from her father into her purse. She walked to the door, but stopped at the light switch. She looked back at the room. It wasn't a cage anymore. It was a studio. She took out her phone and dialed a number. "Hello?" a voice answered. It was the gallery owner who had represented her small, unnoticed art shows years ago. "Hi, David," Flora said. "It's Flora Vance." "Flora, my God, I saw the news. Are you okay?" "I'm better than okay," she smiled. "I'm calling because I have a new collection I want to debut. It's called The Art of War. Large-scale canvases, industrial themes, gold leaf and iron." "That sounds different for you," David said. "When can you start painting?" Flora looked at the blueprints on her desk. "I already have," she said. "I'll see you soon, David." She flicked off the lights, leaving the office in darkness, save for the glow of the city she now helped keep in motion. Flora Vance walked out to the elevator, the click of her heels sounding like a hammer striking an anvil. Steady, strong, and building something that would last forever. And that is how Flora Vance turned her darkest moment into her greatest masterpiece. Richard didn't just lose the money, he lost the chance to be part of a legacy that was far bigger than his greed. He rotted in a cell while Flora built the future, proving that true power isn't about what you can steal, it's about what you can create. This story reminds us that sometimes the people who underestimate us are actually giving us the fuel we need to burn brighter than they ever could. What do you think? Was Flora's decision to pivot the company too risky, or was it exactly what her father would have wanted? And if you found a hidden will that changed your life, what would you hope it said? Let me know in the comments. If you loved this saga of betrayal and redemption, please smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring you more stories like this. Thanks for watching, stay safe, and remember, never sign the papers until you've read the fine print.